Hey everyone, I'm back again with another Genshin Impact video, and if you didn't read the title of the video or look at the thumbnail, today I'm going to be looking at the constellations of fan favorite Kamisato Ayaka. With Ayaka on banner, I'm sure many people are wondering, should I roll for constellations? After all, if you're someone who rolls for aesthetics, then you don't really need to roll for constellations. Therefore, the only value that constellations have are to increase the capabilities of the already existing character. But how are we going to determine this? Simple, by calculating the average damage increase of each level of Constellation and comparing it to the average damage increase of each refinement level of Ayaka's 5-star basking slot weapon. Before we get started though, we need to set the assumptions that will be used so that everyone's on the same page. First, I'm assuming a base level 90 Ayaka with a level 90 Amenoma Kageuchi at refinement 5, essentially the strongest possible reasonable free-to-play Ayaka. Second, I'm going to be assuming that we're running a maxed out crit build Blizzard Trader artifact set with a freeze-oriented team. Why? Because it's Ayaka's most consistent build, and as far as I can tell, it's also her strongest build due to a combination of ICDs and a lack of consistent off-field pyro applicators. Third, instead of assuming being able to cast Burst off cooldown, which I used to do, I will be calculating damage dealt dependent on Burst Uptime, which means I get to make some cool graphs. Fourth, I'm ignoring Ayaka's sprint time. Yes, I know it has animation time, which is somewhere in the range of 2/3 of a second, which I measured, but I'm more than certain that people will just dash whenever they want anyways, mostly to reposition or dodge attacks. Fifth, I'm going to assume that Ayaka has her infusion up constantly. It makes things a lot easier for me to calculate, and it isn't that bad of an assumption to make if we also assume that Ayaka will be dodging from time to time anyways. That's about it for assumptions and notes, so let's get started. The first step we need to take is calculate the stats Ayaka will have at the bare minimum. Ayaka herself, at level 90, has a base 342 attack, 5% crit rate, and 38.4% crit damage. However, we also have to factor in her passives, most notably her passive 2, which grants her an 18% crowd damage bonus whenever she hits an enemy with her dash. Next, we have to factor in artifact stats. Due to the way damage works in Genshin, stacking as much crit as possible is typically the most optimal way to build most DPS characters. Now, I am using the best possible artifact rolls to calculate these numbers, because this should give you an idea of the uppermost limit of damage that a freeze Ayaka build would net you at C0, which, if you're serious about min-maxing, should be roughly what you're aiming for. Now, is this actually attainable stats? Absolutely not. No one will ever get stats like this. It is literally impossible. Anyways, using maxed out artifacts, it's possible to gain an additional 311 attack, 99.07% attack bonus, 63.35% crit rate, 209.38% crit damage, and 46.6% crowd damage bonus. If we assume the enemies are effectively perma-frozen, which is possible with a few characters like Xingqiu, Kokomi, Barbara at close range, or the upcoming Yelan, Blizzard Trader's 4-piece set bonus will add an additional 40% crit rate, and its 2-piece set bonus will add 15% crowd damage bonus. If your team is double cryo, the cryo resonance bonus will also increase Ayaka's crit rate by 15%, but I'm going to not use it in part of my calculations because there is a chance that the enemies can't be frozen, like with bosses or elemental enemies, so this will help shore up that missing crit rate in those circumstances. But not everyone is running a double cryo, so take it as you will. Finally, we have to add in weapon stats, which as stated previously will be the Amenoma Kageuchi, which adds 454 base attack and a 55.1% attack bonus. Adding these all up, we end up with total stats of 796 base attack, 311 additional attack, 154.17% attack bonus, 103.35% crit rate, 209.38% crit damage, and 80% crowd damage bonus. With the base stats out of the way, there comes the next step, and that's actually figuring out how much damage does Ayaka do at this base level. To calculate this, I went ahead and measured the amount of time needed for each possible attack and action used during Ayaka's rotation. Her normal attack combo requires about 183 frames, or 3.05 seconds to complete, according to my measurements. Her skill requires about 51 frames, or 0.85 seconds to complete, and her burst requires about 117 frames, or 1.95 seconds to complete. Now I know that Kuching mains has frame data for Ayaka, which is quite extensive and very useful, but I'm not entirely sure what they're measuring as. While I'm measuring animation times, as in when you start attacking to the point where you can begin a new action, it appears they're counting something else. I think for their normal attacks, they're actually counting the frames, or the exact frame that the attack lands, which is why their numbers are all about half a second faster than my values. As such, I'm going to go by my values as opposed to theirs, since I don't actually know what they're measuring. Using the frame data and the level 10 stats for Ayaka's abilities, I derived the damage percent per second values for the 4 major attacks she uses, which are the normal attacks, charge attacks, skill, and burst. Multiplying these values against the damage formula, I was able to get the DPS of Ayaka, roughly at least. The way I have it set up, I have 2 data values. The first is the average DPS of Ayaka during the cooldown of her skill, which is 10 seconds. In this time span, and accounting for animation time, Ayaka can use her skill 1 time and her normal attack rotation 3 times. The second DPS measure is Ayaka's DPS for the duration of her burst, assuming it hits every time. And this only lasts for about 5 seconds, which, accounting for the time spent in her animation, means she can only use her burst and 3.05 seconds of her skill cooldown DPS. I'm using the skill cooldown DPS here because there will be times where right after using Ayaka's burst, her skill will be off cooldown. With this, at base, Ayaka will deal 30,163.2 DPS over her skill cooldown and 125,890.4 DPS during her burst. Alone, these numbers are kind of meaningless, but they'll make more sense once we factor in burst uptime, which I'll be doing at the end of this video. Also, if you do the math yourself, you'll find that these numbers don't seem to add up properly, and that's because they include Ayaka's passive 1, which increases her normal and charge attack damage by 30% for 6 seconds after she uses her skill, so I just factored that in for about 2 normal attack rotations since those take about 6 seconds. Now that we have Ayaka's damage percent per second rotations and base DPS all set up, we can finally start looking at Ayaka's constellations. Ayaka's first constellation is Snow Slip Sakura, which grants her a 50% chance on each infused normal attack to decrease her skill cooldown by 0.3 seconds, capped at once per 0.1 seconds. Going by the frame data acquired by Klitzing mains, we can see that the time between each strike of Ayaka's normal attacks is at least 6 frames, which is equivalent to 0.1 seconds. Therefore, with the assumptions that we're using, we can additionally assume that Ayaka will have a 50% chance to proc her C1 every normal attack. But what does this translate to for DPS? Considering that Ayaka can use 3 normal attack rotations within the cooldown of her skill, and Ayaka hits a total of 7 times per rotation, Ayaka should reduce her skill cooldown by a total of 3 seconds per normal skill cooldown. If you're thinking critically, however, you should notice that decreasing the skill cooldown by 3 seconds would practically eliminate the time for that 3rd normal attack rotation. Therefore, we need to find the sweet spot for casting Ayaka's skill off cooldown combined with the maximum number of normal attack rotations. Doing the math real quick with these 2 nifty formulae and fitting a graph to it, we find that the intersection between these two is 2.2317, which just translates to Ayaka being able to do 2.2317 normal attack rotation per skill cooldown on average with her C1. This will change her DPS for Ayaka over her skill cooldown to 32,136.8 DPS. Not that big of a difference, to be entirely honest. Her DPS over her burst duration will slightly increase to 127,094.3 DPS. Moving on to Ayaka's Constellation 2, Blizzard Blade Seki no To, whenever Ayaka uses her burst, she creates 2 smaller additional Frostflake Seki no To, each one dealing 20% of the original burst's damage. This effectively functions as a 140% multiplicative bonus to Ayaka's burst. As a note, despite the fact that the 2 Frostflakes are created to either side of the initial burst, they all stop if they hit a large enemy, so it's actually pretty easy to just point-blank cast Ayaka's burst and have all 3 hit the proper target. But adding that 140% bonus to Ayaka's burst, we retain the C1 skill cooldown DPS of 32,136.8 DPS, while her burst duration DPS increases to 170,090.6 DPS. A much more substantial increase, though again, this is not the final value, and means little to nothing on its own. Ayaka's Constellation 3, Frostbloom Kamifubuki, is the generic increased burst talent level by 3, which just changes the modifiers of the talent, increasing them from 4,143.87% to 4,892.12%. Ayaka's skill cooldown DPS is still the same, at 32,136.8 DPS, while her burst duration DPS increases to 197,263.8 DPS. Ayaka's Constellation 4, Ebb and Flow, decreases enemy defense by 30% for 6 seconds after being hit by her burst. This is a very straightforward 130% multiplicative damage boost to Ayaka during her burst, and for 6 seconds afterwards. This will therefore increase her burst duration DPS to 256,442.9. However, this will also increase her skill cooldown DPS for those 6 seconds to 41,777.8. Again, it's pretty much meaningless until we factor in burst uptime, since this effect will be more pronounced with a higher burst uptime. Ayaka's Constellation 5, Blossom Cloud Iritsuki, increases the talent level of Ayaka's skill, so we just modify the talent modifiers and get a new skill cooldown DPS of 33,453.7 and a burst duration DPS of 257,487.2. Finally, Ayaka's Constellation 6, Dance of Suigetsu, grants Ayaka a 298% additive damage bonus to her charge attacks once every 10 seconds. This is a bit annoying because this would affect Ayaka's theoretical rotation, right? Not quite, because there is an easy workaround we can do with this constellation. If we lengthen Ayaka's normal attack rotation to a total 10.47 seconds, which sounds arbitrary, we can fit in exactly 3 normal attack rotations and 1 charged attack. Add up the total damage and divide by 10.47 seconds, and we get the average DPS of Ayaka over a normal/charged attack rotation. To make this fit into my data, I had to multiply this value by 3.05 to get the average damage over the normal attack rotation time period, so if you check the spreadsheet and see that multiplied by 3.05, that's why. Anyways, we can then use this final value and plug it into the skill cooldown DPS formula to get 45,617.7 DPS and a burst duration DPS of 267,133.3. So, how do we use these numbers? Well, to put it simply, I created 2 groups, uptime DPS and downtime DPS. Both were based on 20-second intervals since that's the cooldown of Ayaka's burst. Uptime DPS was calculated by taking the burst duration DPS, multiplying it by 5, adding it to skill cooldown DPS, which was multiplied by 15, then dividing the whole thing by 20. Downtime DPS was equal to just skill cooldown DPS. After this, uptime DPS would then be multiplied by an uptime stat, which was a percentage, then added to downtime DPS, which was multiplied by a downtime stat, which was also a percentage, to get average DPS based on uptime, because the downtime is equivalent to 1 minus uptime. Doing so results in this nifty graph. As you can see, C1 is practically useless. At a 0% burst uptime, C1 is a 6.54% damage increase. At a 100% burst uptime, it's actually only a 3.29% damage increase. Now, why did it go down? Well, that's because C1 only increases the skill cooldown DPS, which means that as burst uptime increases, the difference between C1 and C0 actually shrinks. Now, C2 is leagues better than C1 at higher burst uptimes, with a 23.16% damage increase compared to C0, and a 19.24% damage increase compared to C1 at 100% burst uptime. At 0% burst uptime, C2 has a 6.54% increase compared to C0, and a 0% increase compared to C1, because C2 only affects the burst damage. C3 at 0% burst uptime is identical to C2 and C1, and at 100% burst uptime has a 35.72% increase over C0 and a 10.2% increase over C2. C4 at 0% burst uptime is also identical to C3, 2, and 1, and at 100% burst uptime has a 68.42% increase over C0 and a 24.09% increase over C3. C5 at 0% burst uptime has a 10.91% increase over C0 and a 4.1% increase over C4. At 100% burst uptime, it has a 70.95% increase over C0 and a 1.5% increase over C4. C6 at 0% burst uptime has a 51.24% increase over C0 and a 36.36% increase over C5. And at 100% burst uptime has a 94.29% increase over C0 and a 13.66% increase over C5. Alright, so I'm done with all that speedy math. Seeing our data here, the best value to get is actually C4, since that gives a total of 17.105% increase per constellation level over C0. If you're on a budget, then I would suggest going for C2, but that's not really a budget, considering that's at worst 360 rolls, or on average 225 rolls. If you only have enough to get C1, I would honestly suggest not rolling. It's not worth it, and it doesn't even really change the gameplay all that much, so But you know what? So what? Who cares? We know what's the best constellation level to aim for, but how does that compare to Ayaka's best-in-slot weapon, Mistsplitter Reforged? Well, this was actually pretty easy, honestly. See, Mistsplitter does have this lengthy passive here, but it really boils down to 2 things: elemental damage after burst and elemental damage prior to burst. The way I've done the math thus far was assume that the burst was cast as soon as you have enough energy. So there's never a point where Ayaka should have full energy, but have her burst on cooldown. If you do have this problem, then you have too much energy recharge, and you should respec your artifacts. Have fun with that. So I just plugged all the elemental damage bonuses and created another DPS metric that calculated the average DPS of Ayaka after she casted her burst, which took the burst duration DPS times 5, plus the skill cooldown DPS times 5, and divided the whole thing by 10. Using that number, I just plugged it into the DPS formulas, and bam, look at that new graph. Now, I know it looks messy, but that's because I've overlaid the Constellation data with the Mistsplitter data. As we can see on the graph, the jump from Amenoma Kageuchi to Mistsplitter is substantial. Specifically, it's a 37.6% increase at 100% burst uptime. But more importantly, we can see that the Mistsplitter at R1 is actually better than Constellation 3 at all possible burst uptime values. It's not until Constellation 4 that Ayaka is capable of outscaling Mistsplitter with Amenoma Kageuchi. Of course, if you can get C4 with Ayaka, don't even bother with getting Mistsplitter since it is capable of outscaling even R5 Mistsplitter. Though this only happens when you have an 82% burst uptime, which may be difficult depending on your comp. So, what other conclusions can we draw from this besides the ones already made? Well, since weapon stats are pretty much independent from Constellations, we can see that while R1 is a great boost to Ayaka's damage from Amenoma Kageuchi, getting additional refinements is actually not a good investment, with each one being about 3 to 4% better than the previous refinement, and this holds roughly true for any Constellation level and any burst uptime percent. Thus, if you're a spender, go for Mistsplitter before going for Constellations. But if you already have Mistsplitter, don't bother getting refinements and just try for C2, C4, or C6. If you only have enough rolls to get either C1 Ayaka or R1 Mistsplitter, I would honestly suggest not rolling at all because the weapon banner is a trap and C1 is so abysmally weak that you're better off rolling on a different character to just build a better team or for entertainment or literally whatever. Keep in mind though, it does take approximately 112.5 rolls to get a banner up character and approximately 138.5 rolls to get a banner up weapon. So it also depends on how many rolls you have available that determines what you should roll for. If you have like enough to pretty much guarantee C2 Ayaka, I would just go for Mistsplitter at that point. Again, look at the graph, R1 Mistsplitter is just so much better than Ayaka's C1, 2, and 3 at any given burst uptime percent. My last Constellation video about Ganyu, I did do some math to determine the best damage per wish upgrade, but given that most people have like a random amount of wishes available to them at any point in time, I feel that it's kind of a useless metric. And it also depends on how lucky some people feel. Like, just because it takes on average 138.5 wishes to get a banner up weapon, you could easily just end up spending 200 over wishes just because you're unlucky. There is literally a 45% chance you have to roll 3 separate 5 stars to get 1 Mistsplitter. So just because using the value of 138.5 rolls will have some arbitrary damage per wish value, it doesn't really mean anything. So I'm going to leave that decision up to you guys. If you want to roll for either Constellations or refinements, you now have the rough math for the DPS bonuses that they give, so you decide. Finally, as a reminder, these values are mostly fully optimized. No one's Ayaka will literally ever hit these values consistently. It's impossible. They're just theoretical values to help smoothen the math a bit. And I think that's about it for this video. As with my other math-heavy videos, if you want to see the spreadsheet I used, the link is in the description below. The graphs were, again, made in MATLAB, so I can put up like the code I used in the spreadsheet, but I'm not sure most, if many, of the people will actually understand what I did, but I think it's fairly self-explanatory. You can just look through it, I guess. If I got anything wrong, just put it in the comments below. I've been wrong before. I'll probably be wrong again. I had to rewrite this script 4 times because I did the math wrong 4 times. And, yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video or otherwise learned something from it. Thanks for watching. Bye!